Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Tong Zhao. He's a nuclear policy fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Also with us is Zhao Ma. He's an associate professor of modern Chinese history and culture at Washington University in St. Louis. From Boston, Myung-koo Kang is a professor of political science at Baruch College of the City University of New York. And Becker is an analyst on U.S. DPRK relations and has traveled to the DPRK numerous times. He is right here with us in the studio. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Myung-koo Kang, let me start with you. We're saying that this is a historic meeting, very symbolic, but how significant is it? How important is it for the people of South Korea and the people of the DPRK?
Of course, it's monumental and a remarkable event. And as you know well, before even the summit meeting, more than 70% of South Korean people support in a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un. And at the same time, as we know well, there were two summit meetings before this one, 11 years ago, 2006, 2007, and this is 11 years later, third summit meeting. And from the South Korean people's point of view, continuing the inter-Korean reconciliation and building more peaceful relations with North Korea is very important. But at the same time, in this summit meeting, as we know well, for the first time, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un crossed DMZ, MDL, military division line. It's the first time after the end of the Korean War in 1953. And then some Korean people describe the situation as a kind of surreal. It means a remarkably touching, and many Korean people, as far as I know, they cried with tears because this kind of inter-Korean reconciliation and the commitment for prosperity is a big deal for them.
Myung-koo Kang, let me ask you this. What is your assessment of why this meeting took place at this time? Why now?
Important thing is that the Kim Jong-un, how to interpret Kim Jong-un's intention and his overall estimation going on around the Korean Peninsula, whether it's a defensive way or whether it reflects his confidence. My understanding is that Kim Jong-un seems to be confident about nuclear capability of North Korea, and he wants to be recognized as a nuclear power from the United States and the rest of the world, and regime's survival or security seems to be almost ready. So he wants to normalize the relations with the United States. I think that seems the primary goal and concern.
Okay, let's go to Beijing. Tong Zhao, both leaders have agreed to work to rid the peninsula of nuclear weapons. That's pretty ambitious on the one hand, and for the DPRK, it's probably risky as well, seeing that it's been the target of threats from the United States. But realistically, are these leaders just expressing a hope here, or do you see a chance that we will see a peninsula that's free of all nuclear weapons?
Well, this joint commitment to the ultimate goal of denuclearization made at the highest level of decision-making is important progress, I would say. If we consider the fact that after Kim Jong-un came into power at the end of 2011, North Korean government has never officially committed itself to this goal of denuclearization. And now this is first time that the North Korean supreme leader made such a commitment, and that's important, I think. But looking into the future, of course, this commitment does not involve a clear timetable or deadline to achieve nuclear disarmament. And in fact, they included the statement in the joint declaration that they want to pursue a phased process of disarmament, meaning they are looking forward to start with near-term steps, such as freezing North Korea's nuclear capabilities, stopping further missile tests, even dismantling the nuclear test site, and hoping that direct engagement between the two sides will start to build some confidence and trust, which might be imperative for them to take more radical steps in the future. So they are willing to do it in a pragmatic way.
Zhao Ma, if we look at what has been taking place and we look at its implications for the region, We have both sides talking about denuclearization. We have both sides talking about a formal end to the war. There could probably be a treaty that will be signed. And when we look at this rapprochement, how important is it for the region, and especially to China, which of course shares a border with the DPRK?
Well, I think for China, this is a very significant or positive step. And because China for a long time trying to persuade that the diplomatic solution is going to be the best solution for this very complex situation. And but for the over the past, especially since Donald Trump took the office, and we see the escalation of conflicts, and both at verbal level and also at the action level and on the ground. So I think for China, they are very welcome this sort of a phased and a diplomatic solutions, and especially the both North and South Korea take leadership and take the initiative and to move the process. I think for China, this whole process will get China's blessing, and but the only problem or the only uncertainty is how the United States will react to this negotiations, because now we can see there are probably two timetables. So one is on the inter-Korean side, so it's more about a phased and a slow process and towards the denuclearization. But on the other hand is the U.S. side. They're talking about the complete, irreversible and verifiable denuclearization. So, and also pressured by the midterm election and the domestic politics. So the Donald Trump, whether or not would take this as a significant progress, that'll be a big question. So, China's dealing with this this gap of the two timetables.
Brian, how is the U.S. responding to this?
Well, it's very interesting, in fact. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, some of the major media outlets treated it, I would say, the way they should. It's possibly the opening of a new era, a really new era, the Korean War coming to an end. Just thinking about that, we've talked about it in the past, it could actually be happening. The leaders of North and South Korea said that's what's happening. But then you look at the Washington Post, and it seemed like the Washington Post, representing, I would say, other factions within the Washington establishment, are alarmed that peace could be breaking out. They're actually, at this very moment, ramping up the rhetoric against the North Korean leadership. And we're doing this because there is a schizophrenia in U.S. foreign policy. We say we want peace in the Korean Peninsula. We want denuclearization, but when the prospects for peace actually seem to be at hand, it also challenges the basic Cold War narrative, which has been used as a pretext for the Asia pivot, stationing 60% of U.S. naval and air assets into the Asia-Pacific region by 2020, and to also incentivize selling more and more weapons into that area. So there's a tug of war going on in Washington right now. I think the Trump administration, by saying, I give my blessings, which is weird in a way, because of course Koreans shouldn't have to have the blessings of a foreign leader to talk to other Koreans, but nonetheless it shows that Trump actually perhaps wants this to happen. I've been saying from the beginning that this could happen. I think the North Koreans and South Koreans, by seizing the initiative, have created the momentum. So you have Mike Pence, the military-industrial complex, the Washington Post say, slow down, don't do this, but momentum is momentum, and that's what's going on.
Now, Brian, you focused on this region, you focused on these two countries and the nuclear issue for a very long time. You visited the DPRK. So we have the DPRK, which says that it's going to stop tests, ballistic missile tests, it's going to stop nuclear tests, it's going to shut down one of its nuclear test sites. We have the two leaders meet. What do you think happened in the last few months, or even the last few weeks, that has led us to this?
Well, if you look at Kim Jong-un's New Year address, January 1st, 2018, he said, last year I said we're in the final stage of preparations, and this year he said we've done it. We've perfected our missile technology such that we have an ICBM that can reach the mainland of the United States. We've developed a hydrogen bomb. We've developed what we need for a nuclear deterrent. Then he said, and he said it straightforward. I mean, we knew where he was going because it was so forthright. He said, now we can begin the process of bringing the two Koreas together and also having a lasting peace. We will cease hostilities that will allow others to use as a pretext. Right. And in this accord, even though you say there's generalities, there's clear markers down the road for the next year. And the fact that both sides have said we will not do anything to provoke any hostilities. We will cease hostilities, and we, Koreans, North and South, will become the determiners of the destiny of Korea. Those are very significant words.
Myung-koo Kang, one of the things the two leaders agreed on was that this will lead to four-way talks. By four-way talks, they mean that the United States and China will be added to these talks as well. What will China and the U.S. bring to the talks?
Yeah, basically, as the declaration made it quite clear, ending the Korean War officially. So we need Chinese government's official agreement about changing the truce agreement into a peace treaty, and then U.S. government agreement as well. And another thing, what we have to notice is that Kim Jong-un and then President Moon had a 30-minute just alone without mass media whatsoever, and they talked. And then President Moon arranged a summit meeting with President Trump in mid-May, so before the Kim Jong-un and then Trump summit meeting. I think that is also very important. Another thing is that President Xi promised that he would visit North Korea in the near future. So I expect that probably immediately after the Kim, if it happens, Kim and Trump summit meeting, President Xi may visit North Korea. So these four countries, cooperation in ending the Korean War and then ultimately creating a peace regime in the region would be quite critical. For that purpose, leaders will try to meet more frequently and regularly. Yeah.
Zhao Ma, let's listen to what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Hua Chunying had to say about this latest meeting. Let's watch.
We applaud for the historical step made by the leaders of the DPRK and the Republic of Korea, and appreciate their political resolve and courage. China sincerely hopes that the historical summit would achieve positive results. China has a poem saying, "For all the disasters, the brotherhood has remained. A smile at meeting, and enmity is banished." We hope and expect the historical summit at the border village of Panmunjom would further start a new journey for the lasting peace and stability of the peninsula.
So, Zhao Ma, there we heard it there, the summit being described as historical. But what would China ultimately like to see come out of these talks?
I think for China, the comments from the Chinese officials reflect the Chinese view of the roots of this problem in the Korean Peninsula, which is a security problem. For North Korea, as a government, as a country, as a sovereign country, it does have this survival crisis, which is caused by the U.S. military threat, and also as a result of this Cold War legacy. And so, that's the reason why they hope some kind of a treaty, some kind of an agreement, an international agreement, will assure the North Korean leaders that the regime can survive and without the external threat. So for China, the long-term goal is to make sure that this little solid steps and creating incremental result. And so for people to talk and to de-escalate all the tensions, and then hopefully that will bring into a peace framework that assure the North Korea for its own survival, and then go from there and to really put out a timetable for denuclearization that will eventually satisfy the U.S. concerns.
Tong Zhao, as I pointed out a moment ago, the DPRK decided that it will stop all tests, missile and nuclear, and that it will shut down one of its test sites. Why did the DPRK do this even before substantive talks have started? This would look like a major concession, or is it just to show that they're acting in good faith?
Well, there are some reports that after the 6th nuclear test in September 2017, the test site was seriously damaged. The mountain collapsed, therefore the test site was basically useless, and therefore North Korea wanted to treat it for some favor from the United States. However, I'm very skeptical about that conclusion. I think even though the main portal at the test site, the northern portal, was probably damaged to a certain extent, there are other portals at the same test site, especially the western portal that the North Koreans has been working on over the last few years. Looks still intact from the impact of the last test. And if North Korea wants to conduct additional tests, they can for sure use that portal and the other underground tunnels near that. So I think the decision to stop tests and also to dismantle the test site was primarily a political decision. North Korea has already obtained not only a fission bomb, but also a hydrogen bomb. North Korea already mastered the technology to make at least the fission bomb small and light enough to be militarized. So North Korea has achieved the basic nuclear warhead design technology they need. And therefore, they wanted to stop here and come and go back to deal with all the negative consequences resulting from their nuclear testing, i.e. the international economic sanctions and political isolation. So I think this is a sincere step taken by North Korea in the direction of freezing their nuclear capabilities.
Brian, do you see any kind of deal being reached that leads finally to a formal peace treaty between the two Koreas, the possibility of a nuclear-free peninsula, but at the same time, the U.S. retains its troops in South Korea and also continues with its joint exercises with South Korea?
Yes, yes, yes. I think I can see definitely a peace treaty. North and South Korea have removed really the obstacle to a peace treaty. If the North Korean government and the South Korean government say, yes, there should be a peace treaty, we know China will favor a peace treaty. It makes the United States seem really isolated to insist that there be no peace treaty 68 years after the war ended. And so that can happen. The North Korean government has said the removal of U.S. troops from South Korea, and there's about 30,000 of them, is not a precondition. Right. Of course, if there's no war, if there's a peace treaty, then the rationale for the maintenance of U.S. troops, tens of thousands, also disappears. But it's not a precondition for the North Koreans to go forward. So if the North and South can go forward, if they don't have the Washington government acting as a brake or as a veto, right, and they go forward in doing that, the question of U.S. troops in South Korea might be an issue for 5 years from now or 10 years from now. Eventually, it will be an issue, but it doesn't have to be the immediate issue.
Okay, Myung-koo Kang, if we look at what the two sides are talking about, the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, the United States has assets, as they call, weapons, nuclear-capable aircraft and ships that go to South Korea. Does that mean that those nuclear-capable aircraft and ships would also not be allowed there?
Tough question, but it'll take a long time to make some agreement about U.S. strategic assets, deployed, targeting, the Korean Peninsula. But I would say that before that, the more important thing is that normalization between the United States and North Korea, how that process will happen and how that process ultimately institutionalized. That would be quite critical in terms of determining the fate of this strategic asset of the United States. One thing we have to quite seriously think about is that nuclear North Korea, hostile toward China, is a kind of nightmare to China. At the same time, nuclear North Korea, nuclear capability North Korea, and aligned with the United States, that is also really not good for the regional stability. Of course, it's really, worst case kind of scenario to China. So the United States will think about, multidimensional strategic, benefit or cost in terms of dealing with North Korea in the process of normalization or making a peace treaty in the region. I think that would be the case.
Tong Zhao, what's your view on that? Do you see the United States sign on to any kind of a deal which would mean that its military capability, its nuclear capability, will be severely curtailed in that part of the world?
I think I agree that China and the United States have major issues between themselves. Their bilateral strategic competition and rivalry is growing, especially over recent months. So their strategic expectations about the future security structure over the Korean Peninsula is different. Especially the recent diplomatic progress is taking place so fast. both countries have concerns that what would happen if we cannot disarm North Korea immediately, and North Korea's nuclear weapons are here to stay. Will North Korea develop a closer relationship to the other big power, and therefore put oneself interest in danger? So both China and the United States have that concern. So that's why in the joint declaration of the North-South Summit meeting, they included a sentence which says in the future they need to start trilateral or quadrilateral meetings to basically include China and the United States, the two other major powers in this process. They need to, both China and the United States need to have a seat at the table to ensure that their own security interests wouldn't be undermined. There is also a provision in the statement which says the goal is complete denuclearization of the peninsula, which really puts some limit also on the United States. If the U.S. wants to reintroduce nuclear weapons into South Korea to defend against the North Korean nuclear threat, that wouldn't happen in the near-term future.
So, Brian, we now have a process, and this process has started. Now comes the hard part. Where does it go to from here?
Well, Donald Trump goes to meet Kim Jong-un, maybe in Pyongyang. That would be a showstopper. It's possible. Donald Trump is invested in this because of domestic squabbles, as your correspondent said in the beginning. Also, he wants to have some kind of diplomatic victory. Also, Mike Pompeo and the war cabinet that's assembling appear to want to turn their anger or their hostility in the direction back to the Middle East towards Iran. They can't do both things at the same time. So from both good and bad reasons, from my point of view, the U.S. actually needs to have some sort of development, some sort of positive accord in the case of North Korea. Can this happen? I'd say yes again. It can happen. This war needs to end. The Korean people certainly want to end it. I think the people of the world want it to end. There's no reason to continue it. It's a relic of the Cold War. Donald Trump, who would have thought just 7 months ago he was threatening to totally annihilate North Korea, could in fact be the messenger for a historical agreement. That doesn't mean we have to like Donald Trump or his policies, but he might be that person.
Okay. Myung-koo Kang, very quickly, I've got 30 seconds. How much support is there in South Korea for what is taking place right now?
I think it's huge, a lot. Before the summit meeting, more than 70% of South Korean people support the summit meeting. But after the summit meeting, I think it will exceed more than 80%. And I think the more and more Korean people will support, reconciliation between the two Koreas.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.